Open world is a marketing term now. Before it was a marketing thing, often to its detriment. It was just a design decision. Build a space the player can move through without being forced along a predetermined path. These games made that decision before the industry had a name for it, on hardware that wasn't supposed to support it, and in some cases before anyone had agreed on what a video game was supposed to do at all. Shadow of the Beast arrived on the Amiga in 1989 and caused an immediate reaction that had more to do with what it looked like than with how it played. The parallax scrolling across 12 independent layers of background created a depth of field that no other game on any platform was producing, and the visual impression of a genuinely vast, atmospheric landscape receding into the distance suggested a world larger than any side-scrolling game had previously implied. That suggestion was the open-world argument Shadow of the Beast was making. Not that the world was actually traversable in multiple directions, but that it felt boundless in a way that changed what players understood a game world could feel like. The game underneath the visual achievement is punishing and somewhat shallow, a side-scrolling action game with aggressive difficulty and limited mechanical depth. The combat is functional, not interesting, and the world, despite its visual impressiveness, is largely linear. The disconnect between the implied scale of the environment and the actual linearity of the traversal is Shadow of the Beast's central tension, and it's a tension the game never fully resolves. What it contributed to the open-world conversation was purely atmospheric. The idea that a game world should feel bigger than the screen, that the sense of depth and distance was a design value worth pursuing independent of whether that depth was actually playable. Every open-world game that has invested in horizon design, in the feeling of a world that continues beyond what you can currently access, was working from an instinct that Shadow of the Beast was the first to produce visually at that quality. Body Harvest was developed by DMA Design, the studio that would go on to make Grand Theft Auto 3, and released on the N64 in 1998, 3 years before Liberty City. The game put a third-person character in a series of large, drivable environments, let him steal and operate multiple vehicle types, and build a mission structure around freely moving through those environments to complete objectives. That's the GTA formula. Body Harvest had it in 1998 on hardware that was doing something no other console game was doing at the same time. The setting, Earth across multiple time periods, invaded by alien harvesters, was more ambitious than the execution could fully support on N64 hardware. The environments were large but sparse. The vehicle physics were functional rather than satisfying, and the technical limitations of the cartridge format meant the world lacked the density that would make Liberty City feel inhabited 3 years later. Body Harvest was the proof of concept that DMA Design needed to build GTA 3, which means its roughness was the cost of figuring out what the formula required. It never found the audience it deserved, partly because of its timing between major N64 releases, and partly because the hardware gap between what DMA wanted to build and what the N64 could support was wide enough that the game felt unfinished to players who didn't understand what they were looking at. Going back to it now, knowing what it became, changes the experience completely. Body Harvest is the rough draft of one of the most influential games ever made. The original Legend of Zelda released in 1986 on the Famicom Disk System and handed players a map with 9 dungeons and no indication of which order to tackle them in. You could walk into Death Mountain in the first 5 minutes and die immediately. You could find the 8th dungeon before the 3rd. You could spend an hour exploring the overworld before entering any dungeon at all, talking to old men in caves who gave you advice that required context you might not have yet. The game was non-linear by design and trusted players to navigate that non-linearity without a guidance system. The overworld itself was the argument. 16 by 16 screens stitched together into a contiguous map where every transition was immediate and where the geography had logic. Mountains blocked certain paths. Water required specific items to cross. The northern areas were harder than the southern ones in ways that rewarded players who explored south before pushing north. That spatial coherence where the world felt like a place with consistent rules rather than a series of level select screens, was the foundational open-world design principle. Link to the Past built on it. Breath of the Wild took it to its logical conclusion. The original established it on the Famicom. The lack of guidance is the thing modern players most frequently cite as a barrier, and it's a real one. Zelda 1986 expects you to try things the world hasn't told you to try, and some of those things require burning specific bushes or bombing specific walls with no visual indication that they're different from any other. That expectation was normal in 1986. It reads as unfair now, but it was also the source of the discovery that made the game legendary among the players who met it on its own terms.
So few helpful young people.
Shenmue appeared on the Dreamcast, and what it achieved in 1999 is something that the open-world genre still measures itself against. A city block that was dense enough, specific enough, and detailed enough that moving through it felt like moving through a place rather than through a game space. Every shop had inventory that could be browsed. Every vending machine dispensed specific items. Every resident had a name, a face, and a daily schedule that ran without Ryo's participation. The environmental storytelling embedded in the smallest details. The way certain NPCs reacted to weather, the specific businesses that opened and closed at specific times, created a texture of life that open worlds with 10 times the geographic scale still rarely match. This wasn't big. It was thorough, and thoroughness is harder than size. The pacing continues to divide players, and the deliberate slowness that makes the world feel real is the same quality that makes it feel inaccessible to players who came to it from later open-world games that optimize for constant forward momentum. This is asking you to observe rather than to accomplish, and that's a different relationship with a game world than most players are conditioned to expect. Whether that ask is a flaw or a feature is the conversation the game has been generating since 1999.
Yes?
Elite launched in 1984 on the BBC Micro and gave players a procedurally generated galaxy of 8,000 star systems, a trading economy, a combat rating that climbed from harmless to elite, and no story to follow. You decided whether to be a trader, a pirate, a bounty hunter, or some improvised combination of all three, and the game supported those choices without directing you toward any of them. The scope of what it was offering in 1984, on a machine with 32 kilobytes of RAM, is almost impossible to process without understanding the hardware constraint. David Braben and Ian Bell fit a simulation of that scale into a space smaller than most modern image files. The procedural generation was the technical solution that made the scale possible, but the design insight was understanding that players didn't need a handcrafted galaxy. They needed a believable one. Each system had a name, an economy type, a government classification, and a tech level that determined what could be bought and sold there. The information was generated, but it was consistent and logical enough that trading routes emerged naturally from player observation rather than from developer instruction. That emergent economic gameplay of discovering that certain goods were cheap in agricultural systems and valuable in industrial ones was the prototype for every space trading game since. No Man's Sky, Elite Dangerous, and the entire space sandbox genre are direct descendants. What those games added, like better graphics, narrative structure, multiplayer, were additions to a framework that Elite established and that nothing released in the intervening 40 years has needed to fundamentally revise. Sid Meier's Pirates came out in 1987 and offered something that most games still don't fully replicate: a complete life simulation inside a historical setting. You're a privateer in the 17th century Caribbean, sailing between ports, trading goods, attacking ships, negotiating with governors, romancing daughters of nobility, hunting pirates for bounties, and aging in real time until your skills decline and you eventually retire. The game doesn't tell you to do any of those things in any particular order. It builds a world with those systems and lets you construct your own arc through them. The multiple interlocking activities, sea combat, land combat, dancing mini-games for the governor's daughter, top-down town exploration, trading economics. Each had enough depth to support a different kind of player, and they interacted with each other in ways that created emergent stories. A trading run that went wrong became a piracy career. A piracy career that attracted too much attention required switching allegiances. The faction system, where your standing with England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands could be built and destroyed through your choices, created a political web that the game never narrated, but that you felt constantly. The 1987 original and the 2004 remake both have their advocates, and the comparison between them is interesting. The remake has better presentation and more elaborate minigames, but the original has a spareness that makes the world feel more consequential. Neither version has been fully surpassed as a Caribbean life sandbox, which is a strange thing to be able to say about a game from so long ago. Ultima 7 The Black Gate built a world where every object was physically simulated, not as a design statement, but as a natural consequence of Richard Garriott's conviction that a believable world required consistent rules. Ovens actually bake bread if you put dough in them. Wells contained water you could draw. NPCs had schedules that ran independently of your presence. They woke up, went to work, ate meals, and slept on their own clock rather than waiting to be interacted with. The world was a system rather than a set, and that distinction is what made it feel alive in ways that contemporaries couldn't replicate. The Fellowship, the sinister organization at the center of the game's conspiracy, was also doing something that most RPGs avoided. It was critiquing real-world ideological manipulation with enough specificity that it generated controversy. The Black Gate was asking what a charismatic authoritarian movement looked like from the inside, and it was asking that question through the mechanics of the game's social simulation rather than through cutscenes. NPCs who had joined the Fellowship behaved differently. Their dialogue shifted. The world's reaction to the organization was embedded in how the simulation ran, not in how the story was told. The hardware demands were extreme then. It required more memory than most machines had, which limited its audience severely. The game was also notoriously hostile to DOS memory managers, and the installation process was one of the most complex of the era. Those barriers meant that the most ambitious PC RPG of 1992 was experienced by fewer people than it deserved. King's Field on the original PlayStation in 1994 built a first-person dungeon in 3 dimensions with no loading screens between areas, no health regeneration, permanent death consequences, and a world that connected to itself through shortcuts, locked doors, and environmental changes in ways that required the player to carry a mental map rather than a provided one. From Software's first game was already doing what Dark Souls would be celebrated for 20 years later. An interconnected world that revealed its geography through exploration, then through a map screen, with a difficulty that treated death as information, not failure. The movement is extremely slow by any standard. King's Field moves at a pace that modern players find genuinely disorienting in its commitment to a crawling, deliberate rhythm. That speed was a design choice tied to the weight and consequence the game wanted combat and exploration to carry, and it produces a specific kind of tension that faster games can't replicate. Every encounter feels significant because the cost of failure is real and because reaching the encounter required actual effort to navigate to. The connection to what From Software would eventually build with the Soulsborne series is direct and undeniable, and playing King's Field now, with that context, makes the design lineage visible in a way that the original audience couldn't have anticipated. The seamless world, the environmental storytelling, the deliberate pacing, the sense that the player is a visitor in a space that exists independently of their presence. All of it is here in 1994, running on the launch hardware of the original PlayStation. Dark Souls didn't invent its philosophy. King's Field did. The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall was released in 1996 and generated a world approximately the size of Great Britain. 62,000 square miles of procedurally created terrain, around 15,000 towns and villages, and hundreds of thousands of NPCs with names and schedules. The map was so large that players frequently went weeks without visiting the same location twice, And the procedural generation that made that scale possible also meant that most of the content was indistinguishable from itself. That tension between scale and quality is the central design problem that this game posed, and that Bethesda's subsequent games spent 20 years trying to resolve. The quest system was also procedurally generated, which meant the game could provide an essentially infinite stream of contracts, commissions, and bounties. Most of them were the same few quest templates repeated with different names and locations plugged in. But the world around those quests, the political factions, the class guilds, the lycanthropy and vampirism systems, the degree to which your character's skills and background actually shaped what was available, was deep enough that players stayed despite the repetition. Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim each traded some of Daggerfall's scale for handcrafted content, and each iteration of that trade produced a game more players could access and fewer players considered the best in the series. The players who prefer the procedural enormity over the authored intimacy. This is still arguing for a design philosophy that the industry has never fully revisited. Fallout arrived in 1997 as a top-down isometric RPG set in a post-nuclear California. And what it built was a world where your choices had genuine consequence at a scale most RPGs were afraid to attempt. The main quest had a time limit. The water chip your vault needed would fail within 150 days, and the game ran that clock in real time. You could spend those days however you chose, but the deadline was real and the world would end if you ignore it long enough. That design choice, giving a free-roaming RPG an actual expiration date, created a relationship between player freedom and narrative stakes that most open-world games still avoid. The skill-based character system shaped what the world looked like from each playthrough. A high-speech character moved through the same locations as a high-combat character, but experienced them completely differently, talking their way through situations that required violence in another run, accessing information that combat builds couldn't reach, following narrative paths that only open for characters the world perceived as credible. The same geography produced genuinely different games, depending on how you built the character entering it. The tone was the other thing Fallout established that the genre absorbed completely. Dark humor about nuclear optimism, consumer culture presented as apocalyptic artifact, a retro-futurist aesthetic that treated the 1950s as the future that never was. None of that was accidental, and all of it has been so thoroughly adopted by the series and the games it influenced that it's easy to forget it had to be invented. The Fallout universe's specific flavor of post-apocalypse is an original creation, and that game is where it was articulated completely for the first time.